What if we told you that Cuba, a nation under US sanctions for decades, is about to make its largest international investment ever, right in the heart of Africa? This tells us two things. First, African nations aren't as poor as they are shown by the West. They attract investments. And second, when pressed with sanctions, nations like Cuba won't stay bowed down, but will find new options. But what does Cuba see in Burkina Faso that the West is too blind to notice? And is Cuba making any investments that will come off as a revenge to the West? Let's find out. Is Africa making a comeback?
And until we dismantle some of those borders, until we begin to wake ourselves up as a people, until we begin to realize that the colonizers and the rule of divide and conquer left us feeling inferior, white supremacy was introduced from the very onset. When the colonizers came to Africa, we were taught to believe that everything African was bad, everything European was better.
The West has long been comfortable labeling Africa as a developing continent, a place in perpetual need of saving, guidance, of Western wisdom. But what if Cuba's historic investment in Burkina Faso is the first move in an African comeback that will surprise the world? This investment isn't just about economics, it's about shifting the balance of power. For too long, Africa has been treated as a resource pool for others to exploit. Now Africa is showing that it will no longer be content playing a secondary role in global affairs. Burkina Faso, with its rich natural resources but a history of being overlooked, has long been dismissed as a nation doomed to struggle under poverty and insurgency. The West has labeled it insignificant, focusing instead on more politically stable and economically attractive nations. But that's where the West got it wrong. Cuba is stepping in where others have failed to see potential, making the largest international investment in its history. And it's not because Burkina Faso is the wealthiest nation in Africa. It's because Cuba sees something that the West does not: opportunity and potential that have been ignored for far too long. Let's break this down. Cuba's investment isn't about rescuing Burkina Faso from its challenges. Instead, it's about empowering Burkina Faso to solve those challenges on its terms. This is a partnership built on mutual benefit, something that the West has never been interested in. The West's model has always been based on control, using aid and investment as tools to maintain dominance over Africa. But Cuba's approach is different. This investment isn't about imposing conditions, it's about collaboration. Burkina Faso stands to gain far more than just money from this investment. The partnership will fuel growth in critical sectors such as healthcare, renewable energy, and education. These are the building blocks of a sustainable future, one that allows Burkina Faso to rise on its terms, without relying on the West's empty promises of aid that often comes with strings attached. But here's the real power of this investment. It's not just symbolic. It's a signal to the rest of Africa, and to the world, that the continent is ready to rise. Africa is no longer the charity case that Western powers have long painted it as. Cuba is showing that there's a different path forward for Africa, one that doesn't involve dependency, but instead focuses on empowerment and partnership. This raises an important question: why Cuba? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. Why would a nation that has faced economic challenges of its own decide to make its largest international investment in Africa? What does Cuba see that the rest of the world is missing? To understand why Cuba is making this unprecedented move, we need to look at the broader context of Cuba's position in the world. Why would a country like Cuba, still economically constrained by decades of US sanctions, choose to make such a large investment in Africa? It's not about charity. It's about something much deeper: a shared history of resistance and a mutual understanding of what it means to fight for sovereignty and self-determination. Cuba has always stood in solidarity with oppressed nations, particularly in Africa. During the Cold War, Cuba played a key role in supporting African liberation movements. From Angola to Algeria, Cuba was there, providing not just military support but also medical assistance, education, and training. This investment in Burkina Faso is not a departure from that legacy. It's a continuation of it. But this time, the battlefield is economic, not military. Cuba knows firsthand what it's like to be isolated by the West, to be treated as a pariah for daring to defy Western powers. They recognize that Africa's struggle for economic independence is not so different from their own. This is why Cuba is choosing to invest in Africa now, because they see in Burkina Faso a nation that is ready to rise above its challenges, just as Cuba has done for decades. This investment isn't just about money, it's about expertise. Cuba is bringing its world-renowned healthcare system, its cutting-edge biotechnology, and its renewable energy technology to Burkina Faso. These are areas where Cuba excels, despite its economic limitations. By focusing on these critical sectors, Cuba is helping to lay the foundation for long-term sustainable growth in Burkina Faso. It's not about short-term gains, it's about building something that will last. And here's where things get interesting. Cuba's investment in Burkina Faso isn't just about helping one country. It's about setting an example for the rest of Africa. Cuba is showing that it's possible to break free from the cycle of dependency on Western aid. It's possible to build partnerships that are based on mutual benefit rather than exploitation. This is a model that could be replicated across the continent, sparking a wave of investment and development that finally allows Africa to take control of its destiny. So, why is Cuba betting big on Africa? Because they see what the West refuses to acknowledge, that Africa is the future. The West has long taken Africa for granted, seeing it only as a source of resources to be exploited. But Cuba sees a continent that is ready to rise. And by investing in Burkina Faso, Cuba is positioning itself as a key partner in Africa's resurgence. But don't be misled that Cuba is doing all this for Africa. No, it also benefits from it as well. And what are those? Investing in Burkina Faso allows Cuba to strengthen its diplomatic ties with Africa, particularly with nations that have shared histories of resistance against colonialism and Western exploitation. For Cuba, this investment helps diversify its international economic engagements. The country has long been isolated due to U.S. sanctions, and investing in Africa provides a strategic opportunity to expand its economic footprint beyond traditional markets.
President Biden announcing new sanctions targeting the Cuban regime.
Local 10's Eden Chuckles in the newsroom with everything we are learning about this crackdown. Eden.
Christy, Janice, the administration says they're imposing those sanctions as early as today.
By focusing on sectors like healthcare, biotechnology, and renewable energy, Cuba can create new revenue streams and reduce its economic dependency on other regions. Burkina Faso is rich in natural resources, particularly in gold and agricultural potential. By investing in key sectors such as agriculture and infrastructure, Cuba could gain access to these resources, helping to bolster its domestic economy. Securing access to essential materials will reduce Cuba's dependence on imports and strengthen its position in the global economy. This investment allows Cuba to enhance its influence within the global South and among non-aligned nations. By partnering with Burkina Faso, Cuba positions itself as a leader in South-South cooperation, challenging Western dominance in Africa. This move could increase Cuba's leverage in international forums like the United Nations and the non-aligned movement, where solidarity among developing nations is crucial. By establishing strong economic ties with Burkina Faso, Cuba could lay the groundwork for long-term trade relationships with other African nations. This could result in new trade agreements, increased market access for Cuban goods and services, and opportunities for Cuban enterprises to expand into new industries in Africa. As Africa's economies grow, Cuba stands to benefit from increased trade and investment opportunities across the continent. But what does this mean for the West? Could Cuba's investment in Burkina Faso be the first step toward ending the West's dominance in Africa? Is this the beginning of a new era where Africa no longer relies on Western aid to succeed? Let's not beat around the bush. The West has built its global dominance on the backs of African nations. For centuries, the West has exploited Africa's resources, labor, and land, all while keeping the continent dependent on aid that often serves the donor more than the recipient. But what happens when Africa begins to break free from this cycle of dependency? Could Cuba's investment in Burkina Faso be the first step toward the end of Western domination in Africa? Cuba's investment represents a direct challenge to the West's control over Africa. the West's approach to Africa has always been about maintaining dominance through economic manipulation, political interference, and, when necessary, military intervention. But Cuba's approach is different. They're not interested in controlling Burkina Faso. They're interested in empowering it. This investment is about building infrastructure, developing healthcare systems, and harnessing renewable energy. These are the areas that will allow Burkina Faso to become self-sufficient and to stand on its own without needing to rely on the West's so-called aid packages that often come with more strings than benefits. But the real threat to the West isn't just the loss of control over one nation. It's the potential for this partnership to inspire a wave of similar investments across Africa. If Cuba can successfully partner with Burkina Faso to build a sustainable future, what's stopping other nations from doing the same? What's stopping African nations from seeking out partnerships that benefit them, rather than keeping them in a state of perpetual dependency? This is what terrifies the West. They've built their global power on the assumption that Africa will always need them. But Cuba is proving that Africa doesn't need the West to succeed. Africa may be better off without them. The West's model of aid and investment is outdated, and it's failing. Cuba's investment in Burkina Faso represents a new model, one that is based on true partnership and mutual benefit. The West is panicking because they know that once Africa starts to break free from their control, their entire global system of dominance begins to unravel. They can no longer rely on Africa's resources to fuel their economies, and they can no longer use aid as a tool to manipulate African governments. Cuba's investment is the first crack in the West's control over Africa, and it's only a matter of time before the entire system comes crashing down. Let's think even bigger. What if the partnership between Cuba and Burkina Faso isn't just a one-off event, but the beginning of something much larger? Could this be the blueprint for Africa's long-overdue continental awakening? It's not as far-fetched as it might seem. It's the logical next step in Africa's quest for economic sovereignty. For too long, Africa has been forced to rely on Western aid and investment that comes with conditions that often do more harm than good. But now, with Cuba's investment in Burkina Faso, a new model is emerging. This model isn't about dependency, it's about empowerment. It's about building partnerships that allow African nations to take control of their futures, rather than being at the mercy of foreign powers. Imagine if other African nations began to follow Burkina Faso's lead, seeking out partnerships that benefit their people, rather than lining the pockets of foreign governments and corporations. This could be the start of a continental movement toward economic sovereignty, where Africa no longer has to rely on the IMF, the World Bank, or Western governments to sustain itself. Cuba's investment is proof that it's possible to build a future where Africa controls its resources and its economies. And once that future is realized, the West's grip on the continent will be broken for good. This isn't just about one country or one partnership. It's about setting a new standard for how Africa engages with the world. It's about showing the rest of the continent that there's another way forward. One that doesn't involve begging for scraps from the Western table, but instead focuses on building something that will last for generations. And the impact of this movement won't be limited to Africa alone. Once Africa begins to rise, the entire global order will shift. The balance of power will move away from the traditional Western powers and toward a more multipolar world, where Africa plays a central role. This is the future that Cuba and Burkina Faso are helping to build. A future where Africa is no longer a passive player in global affairs, but an active and equal participant. But as Africa begins to awaken, what will the global repercussions be? This is the question that Western powers are dreading. What happens when Africa no longer needs them? When nations like Burkina Faso no longer have to rely on the IMF, the World Bank, or Western governments to sustain themselves? The answer is simple. The West's global dominance will crumble. The West has built its entire system on the exploitation of Africa's resources. They've profited from Africa's labor, its minerals, its oil, all while keeping the continent impoverished and dependent. But with partnerships like the one between Cuba and Burkina Faso, that system is starting to collapse. Africa is waking up to its potential, and the West is running out of time to stop it. Cuba's investment in Burkina Faso is proof that Africa doesn't need the West to succeed. Africa will thrive without the West holding it back. And when that happens, the balance of power will shift. The so-called superpowers will have to contend with a new reality, one where Africa is no longer their pawn but their equal. And here's the most important point. The West can't stop this. No matter how hard they try, no matter how many sanctions they impose or how many strings they attach to their aid, they can't keep Africa down forever. The Cuba-Burkina Faso partnership is just the beginning. Africa's rise is inevitable, and the West will have to adapt or be left behind. As Africa's economic independence grows, the West will face a choice. Either support Africa's rise as a true partner or watch from the sidelines as the continent breaks free from its grasp. The days of using aid as a tool of control are coming to an end. Africa is rewriting the rules, and the world is taking notice. This is the beginning of a new era, one where Africa's future is shaped by its people, not by foreign powers with hidden agendas. And when the dust settles, Africa will be standing tall, while the West scrambles to understand how they lost control. Can the West do anything about it? What would happen if they tried to force Africa to end the deal with Cuba? Will Burkina Faso listen? Let us know in the comment section. Is Africa unstoppable now? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.